Hello, and welcome to the inaugural event of PONARS' Strategic Conversations event series. My name is David Szakonyi, and I'm an associate professor of political science here at George Washington University and co-director of PONARS Eurasia. Just to give you some background, PONARS Eurasia is a network of over 140 academics, mainly from North America and Eurasian states, advancing new approaches to research on security, politics, economics, and society in the region. We connect scholarship to policy and try to foster a community, especially of mid-career and early rising scholars committed to developing policy-relevant and collaborative research. We're delighted to welcome you to the first of this event series. Several times a year, we plan on inviting distinguished experts to join in candid conversations on events in the region and deliver their insights on the most pressing issues of the day. These events will also provide an opportunity for all of you to ask questions and engage with our experts, as well as to enjoy the refreshments afterwards to continue the conversation about all the topics that we're raising here today. Today's conversation comes at a pivotal time in the region, economic and political development, with the conflict in Ukraine seemingly being ground to a stalemate and concerns rising here in Washington, D.C., that continued support may be at a turning point and may not be a thing of certainty going forward. Against this backdrop, we're delighted to have two of the most distinguished experts here on the region to share their thoughts and to engage in a back and forth on some of the more critical or controversial or even more kind of debated issues on the region. And I'd like you to join me in welcoming them to the stage. I know. First, I'd like to welcome Olga Oliker, who's the program director for Europe and Central Asia at International Crisis Group, an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that will build a more peaceful world. She leads the organization's research, analysis, policy prescription, and advocacy in and about Russia, Europe, Turkey, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Olga's own research interests center on the foreign and security policies of Russia, Ukraine, and the Central Asian and Caucasian successor states to the Soviet Union, domestic politics in these countries, US policy toward the region, and nuclear weapons strategy and arms control. Samuel Charap is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include the foreign policies of Russia and the former Soviet states, European and Eurasian regional security, and US-Russia deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control. He's also the author of a book on the Ukraine crisis, Everyone Loses, the Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia, co-authored with Tim Colton. His articles appeared in the Washington Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, Survival, Current History, and several other journals. I'm going to take a stage at the same level as our distinguished experts rather than hover above you at the podium. So forgive me for the awkward transition to the seat with the microphone. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join with us today. I know you both have a ton of interesting insights that I'd like to tap into, and I have a couple kind of questions to get the conversation started. So, Olga, maybe we can start with you, because I know you've done some recent travel to the region. What does the situation on the ground in Ukraine look like, and how do you see the conflict developing over the coming months?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind introduction. So Ukraine, like a lot of places at war, parts of it seem absolutely normal, right? Kiev is great place to get a cup of coffee. New coffee shops sprout up like every other block. Restaurants are open. People are out and about. On Saturday night, the bars are, absolutely overcrowded and filled, and you can't get a table. Closer you get to the front lines, the more that changes. And what's interesting is Kiev does, you get the air raid sirens, and what happens as soon as an air raid siren goes, and you have a phone app, right? Your phone gives you your siren. People go on Telegram, they try to figure out what it is. And then based on what it is, they make this decision of, do I go down into the basement? Do I go on about my business? Where am I anyway? And a lot of people don't seek shelter. And you go further east, you go to Dnipro, you go to Odessa, you get more air raid sirens. If you are trying to be good and go down for each one, you're going to have a really interrupted night's sleep every night. But for the most part, the air defenses keep the missiles away. You get to Kramatorsk, and they tell you that they get 50 bombs every 24 hours. The sirens are, pretty consistent. The meetings are held in basements as a matter of course. And it was my first visit to Kramatorsk since before the full-scale invasion, and it was really a striking change in a city that I'd seen develop from the kind of place everybody leaves back in 2015 to a center for the international aid community, which comes with pluses and minuses, to this place that is it's not abandoned, but you don't have a lot of people walking around on the streets. As to what happens next, I don't know. Look, the front line has not collapsed. The Russians are making progress, but it is small, it's the length of your walking commute sort of progress. The Ukrainians have talked a good talk about a war going back and forth, that, if it's a long war, there's going to be advances, there are going to be retreats. I think the problem is they didn't plan very much for the retreats. So now they are under a lot of pressure to get defensive positions fortified. So they're falling back to things they can actually defend, to get enough people into the ranks that are trained. And this is a huge thing, that people are not adequately trained before they're sent to war, and to make sure they have the ammunition. And of course, the United States is part of the problem there. Will the front collapse next week? No, right? Is there a huge problem in the weeks and months to come if all of this isn't solved? Yes, absolutely. Does that mean that the Russians are going to pour through Ukraine and destroy, everything? Probably not. What probably is going to happen is the Ukrainians surrender, right, under those conditions, one way or another. And then that has implications for the long term, because the terms of that surrender are going to affect not just Ukraine and Russia, but European security.
Sandra, do you agree with that assessment? Do you have any comments on where you see this conflict evolving over the next couple months?
So I have not been to Ukraine in recent months, so I'm going to defer to Olga on her read on the situation on the ground. The one factor that maybe I would add to her description that seems pretty critical in terms of linking the political to the military is the manpower problem that Ukraine faces. And the fact that in addition to a supplemental assistance bill being stuck in our Congress, they have a mobilization bill that's stuck in their parliament. Even with the kind of munitions that would come with the passage of the supplemental, there need to be people and trained people to fire them. And that is increasingly a problem for Ukraine, as much as the munition shortage or emerging munition shortage. If my task is to find something to quibble with, and Olga and I usually tend to agree on a lot of things, although we do have our disagreements. So I'll maybe just pick up where she left off, which is on the idea of surrender. So I guess I would agree with the assessment that a collapse in the front lines is unlikely, that even the kind of advances that we've seen in the last month or so, most prominently the Donetsk city suburb of Avdiivka, came at tremendous cost to the Russians, and you can't lose, as has been reported, 20,000. You can't have 20,000 casualties taking, a suburb of a city, let alone going to the administrative boundaries of the region they claim to have annexed, to include the city of Kramatorsk and the sort of tri-city conglomeration that it's a part of, with, that's not sustainable over time. So imposition of terms seems, in a way that the lack of the prospect of that, either front collapsing or a Russian breakthrough or something like that makes me skeptical about the prospect of imposed terms, just because I don't see the Russians being in a position to do that, even if their position is likely to gradually improve if the manpower and munitions issues are not resolved in the coming months. So clearly, I'm skeptical about the Russian theory of victory if it means if that is equivalent to, a full-blown Ukrainian surrender.
Do the Ukrainians have a more convincing theory of victory? What does a protracted war look like for Ukraine and then also for Russia? It's a conversation. Feel
Okay.
free to chime in.
So
You hear different things about the Ukrainian theory of victory, and you certainly hear, especially in public, that we must get all of our territory back and the Russians must, effectively disappear off the face of the earth. This is not a likely occurrence, right? At least not without a whole lot of other people, including the Ukrainians, disappearing off the face of the earth along with them. So the other thing you hear, and that's much more something you hear behind closed doors. That's something you hear when people tell you, don't quote me. So I'm not going to quote anyone saying it. I'm just going to tell you I hear it, which is that our survival as a state is a victory. We'll deal with the territory later. And I think the Ukrainian theory of victory is being able to guarantee that they can survive as a state for the long term, whether that's because they've deterred the Russians from further attacks, whether it's because they've gotten into an alliance that deters the Russians from further attacks, whether it's because the Russians aren't capable of launching further attacks, whether it's because the Russians have magically transformed because the good fairy has come down and waved her wand and are no longer interested in Ukraine as a vassal state. But one where that's the Ukrainian vision of how this works. And then most people you talk to, if you press them on this, if they understand these issues, they will tell you we are not going to militarily win back our territory. We're going to get our territory back. It's going to be at the negotiating table.
Sam, you've talked a lot about getting to the negotiation table, the need to start making concerted investments in terms of prepping the ground and, to paraphrase you, talking about talking. To you, what are the benefits and risks of pursuing a diplomatic approach at this stage in the conflict? You've talked a lot about the benefits, but fill out the picture for us. Convince a skeptical onlooker that this is the right course of action for both Ukraine and its allies to really invest heavily in right now.
So if I also might pick up on this question of the theory of victory as well, that is like way more coherent than what you normally hear. And I think I would love that if that were the official policy. I have my doubts.
Can't be the official policy,
Right.
right? I mean, you don't go into negotiations saying, yep, it's fine, we'll give them some territory for a while.
Well, it's one thing to have public talking points differing from the, well, in any case, if it's the secret official policy, then I guess I wouldn't know about it. But in any case, it's more coherent than arguably what a lot of Western governments were saying before the counteroffensive about the endgame, which was that more territory equals better negotiating position. It depends on the circumstances, right? In theory, that makes sense. In practice, the enemy gets a vote. And whether they're just going to, how they'll respond to those circumstances is an important factor in determining what equals leverage. So, I would, there's two questions, right? Like there's the ultimate form in which the war ends. And there, I haven't heard a convincing case about how it doesn't end with some sort of negotiation. And it has been the position of, for example, of the US government, not to say that that's therefore the biblical truth, but from the beginning that this at some point will end in negotiations. And then there's a question about what happens right now. And I think the challenge has been that the, doubtlessly necessary coercive efforts that have been undertaken both by Ukraine and its Western partners against Russia following its full-scale invasion have been counterposed to maintaining channels of communication and having the kind of back channel and or front channel discussions that are common when you're also fighting at the same time. And that, I think, is the short-term issue, which is that we're going to have to move at some point into a more active phase of, if not diplomacy with like flags at the table and a formal negotiating platform, then more regular channels of communication. Now, to be clear, it's not like there are none, but as far as we know, based on what is public information, they're focused on very specific issues. So POWs, the return of abducted children, but those clearly are issues that have had to be negotiated in great detail. And to quote Zelensky about them, negotiations never stopped, even though on other occasions he'll say that it's our policy not to have them. So, I think that moving those kinds of issues on to cover more the broader issues at stake in the war in the short term is where I would see the talking piece of it. So obviously there are risks if it's poorly managed. And for Western governments, those risks are about maintaining the unity that has been a hallmark of at the very least, the Biden administration's approach to this from the beginning. I mean, we see some cracks in that in recent weeks, but that's in the broad parameters, a shift in tactics, you will need some convincing of and that therefore puts some stress potentially on the alliance that's been put together, which includes not only just European allies, but more globally as well. That's one. Two is that another risk that I'm just thinking about risks off the top of my head is that you're not prepared when it starts a more formal process and you end up with a bad arrangement. And we've seen this movie before. It's called Minsk, and the result was not good for Ukraine or regional security more broadly. So doing your homework now is a way of mitigating that kinds of risk. But if we're not talking about talking, then we're not doing that homework, at least as far as I can tell. So those are the two that come to mind most prominently. I'm sure there are others.
Olga, any response to those risks outweigh the benefits in your mind, or is this something we should all be talking more about?
So I think the problem with the narrative of we just need to figure out what a negotiated solution looks like, and then we'll know, and that's the solution. And I don't think that's what Sam is saying, but that is what you'll hear from some quarters, right? That, let's figure this out, right? Let's do this traditional mediation. We'll figure out where the overlaps are, and then we'll have the solution. That's not what's going to happen here, right? There are a wealth of possible ways this ends. A wealth of possible solutions to the problem of two countries claiming the same territory in their constitutions, with the international community agreeing with one of them, but not the other. There are infinite ways of doing this. I think Sam's right that thinking about what your priorities are in a negotiation and what you most want to limit the other party and what you're willing to give up for it, it's a very valuable exercise for everybody to do. In terms of what I've been saying for a long time is if there are real live peace talks going on, I shouldn't know about them. If I know about them, all of Twitter knows about them. And then they get derailed, right? Because putting this in the public eye means everybody who is angry, everybody who doesn't want compromise, everybody who wants to fight to the end, and even if it is a nuclear war, gets into this, and it's very hard to keep the negotiation going. I do think that having more territory, that looking like you're doing well, puts you in a better negotiating position. You never know, though, at what point it all turns around, right? And then your adversary looks like they're doing well and they feel like they're in a better negotiating position. Right now, I would say the Russians ought to be in a better negotiating position. For that reason, if they're interested in talking, I'm very curious, because that may mean they don't think they're in as good a negotiating position. They may not think they have as much time. So it's worth poking and prodding at that, right? Ukraine has every reason to look for a pause right now. They need to get people into the ranks, trained and armed. That is not an instantaneous process, so they could really use a break. In theory, the Russians need that too, but they seem to have been doing a pretty good job of continuing to pour men, and almost 100% men, as opposed to the Ukrainians, where it's like still almost 100% men, never mind, but a couple more women. But the Russians seem to be able to keep pouring men and gear into the fight without blinking. So one wonders when this breaks. A lot of the gear is older. A lot of it is refurbished. They run out of that. Some of it is newer. So, you can ask these questions. You can do this math. Different people will do the math differently. But I think for me, and this isn't really about the risk, but for me, kind of what's interesting about when are talks more likely is if the party that looks like it's in the stronger position is interested in talking instead of pressing on and trying to make their position even better. I want to know what's going on.
Do we learn anything from this week's elections about the Russian position on this? Do we think there is this kind of mirage of Russians appearing to have the upper hand, but a lot of maybe discussion going on behind closed doors that this is an opportunity to kind of pivot or take seriously negotiations? Are there credible signals of that being true for either of you?
So this does, the pivot to the question of domestic politics does raise, of course, another risk that is often brought up that I forgot to mention earlier, which is, of course, that it would, the argument is made that pivoting to negotiations would be a risk for domestic political stability in Ukraine. And I'm sure if done in a dramatic, sort of like out of the blue way, or if it's poorly managed, that might well be true. I can understand the reason for that anxiety. What is interesting, though, is that public opinion in Ukraine on this issue is shifting, and just fresh data from the last couple of weeks, where essentially you have it's essentially 50-50 on if, when asked the question, Ukrainians answering, are they ready to stop the war by making compromises or continuing until they retake either all of their internationally recognized territory or all the territory that was controlled before February 2022. So, it's about 44.3 versus 44.5% on those, two sides of that issue. If you total them both up, and that is a shift from 6 months, 18 months ago for sure. So I think that there's a question of using the political capital that Zelensky has, if he so chooses, and it was less than 2 years ago when he did in fact have a quite different policy on this set of issues. So I do think there are risks there, though, for sure, and we wouldn't want to see the kind of instability that people are concerned about when they raise that. So that is another risk. What's also interesting is that public opinion in Russia seems to be shifting on this issue. So again, this is Russian field data from, I believe, earlier in March, which is kind of amazing. So 75% of those polled Russians would be supportive if Putin were to sign a ceasefire tomorrow. And basically, while at the same time, if asked, 49%, 40% are for continuing the so-called special military operation versus 49%, again, more than those for continuing it, who say that Russia needs to transition to peace talks. So it's those are striking. I mean, and I think in a way if Putin decided tomorrow to sign to end the war, would you support it? And you get a 75% yes. It just suggests that there's actually a lot of freedom of maneuver that he has domestically, perhaps in a way that Zelensky does not, which is kind of obvious given the difference in the nature of the political systems, as it was on vivid display over the weekend. So in a way, I think in the run-up to the election, perhaps there were some ways in which the domestic politics in Russia, or at least the fact of this electoral event over the weekend, could have, limited the bandwidth for this kind of thing, given, of course, that the system itself in Russia, as far as policymaking goes, is pretty broken and also extremely centralized, so that particularly on issues of war and peace, you have only one decision maker. And he had some other things on his mind, generally does. Although this is, I think, probably the thing he spends the most time on. So I don't think anything has fundamentally changed, but maybe there's, a fewer distractions for one party at least than there were before Sunday, or Friday through Sunday.
It's still going.
Yeah. Gift that keeps giving, the Russian election. I am less well prepared than Sam, so I don't have the polling data. What I do have is some notes from an interview where somebody quoted polling data to me. So take that with the caveat that comes with that. And what they noted was, yes, there's been a shift, but also basically at about 3/4 of Ukrainians want to continue to fight. Now, depends on what question you ask and how you ask it. It's a much lower number than it was. Zelensky's approval is also a thing that has been dropping. And I think this is kind of what's interesting here. As somebody who made the argument that Zelensky and his government couldn't survive going to peace talks at a time when the population was very much opposed to them, Zelensky's government may not survive anyway, right? Now, we'd like to see it, if it doesn't survive, not survive in a democratic transition, which Ukraine has had a number of, et cetera, et cetera. There's a big discussion going on about elections. Almost everybody thinks they should not have them, but they also keep talking about them, which, and they'll say, Westerners are pushing us to have elections. You talk to everybody in the Western community. Nope, not pushing them to have elections. Absolutely not. Lindsey Graham's the only Westerner so far who has made any sort of noise that says the Ukrainians should be having elections. But, absolutely everybody, democracy, activists, the government, everyone's opposed to the RADA, everyone's opposed to elections, but they will not stop talking about them. And I think that's kind of interesting. And what one person suggests is you have elections, you get somebody else in, that person can make peace. Maybe Putin is willing to make peace with that person, right? The other option is Zelensky kamikazes, right? He does the deal. This is all super speculative. I do think what Zelensky and team are have been trying to do is cement their place in power, not make peace and ride off into the sunset. So I don't think that's, at least intentionally, a likely scenario. In terms of Russia, I think 75% of Russians will tell you that if Vladimir Putin decides to walk a tightrope and then do a somersault. Do you think this will bring world peace? They'll say, yeah, sure. If we're told that will. So, I think public opinion polls in both of these countries are tough to do. We have people who do them. There's ways to get around them, but a lot of what you read is polling that is done by people who aren't using best practices when they poll. So I think that's the other caveat. I don't know what, your data, I don't know what it is. Maybe it is. So you can tell us what it is, and then I'll tell you how much more I trust it.
I
You
didn't
don't
do the
know.
polling myself.
I know you didn't do the polling, but depending on who did it, right, I'm going to have higher or lower confidence. Like there are Ukrainian polling firms that you can read the questions, right? And they are set up. They are set up to get certain answers. Certainly that's true of Russian polls a lot of the time. So you have to look very carefully. I mean, Gerard here does very good polling because he's aware of these challenges. So that's why I always read everything with buckets of salt next to me.
It seems like both of you are suggesting that the population would broadly follow some leadership from the top if a decision was made. I mean, there's some, even in either country, there's some malleability there that the polling uncertainty is getting at. Do you agree with that assessment?
Ukraine's tough because if you recall the problem, Zelensky ran on a peace platform. He got, that is why people voted for him. And then when he tried to take steps towards implementing Minsk for all of the problems with Minsk, it wasn't that the majority was opposed to him. It was that there was a very vocal minority that was willing to make a lot of noise and show up in the streets, and some of them are armed, and the Zelensky team backed down. So I think that's very plausible that would happen again in Ukraine.
Right, but that's not a public opinion issue, right? That's a
No, but it's
mobilized
what
minority.
will the public go along with it? So I guess what will public opinion think is one thing, but will the public go along with it is another.
And there's no conception of a ceasefire that would satisfy this highly vocal minority that is willing to mobilize and create such political uproar for any politician that takes a risk in Ukraine in that sense. There's no satisfactory negotiation beyond the continuation of the war at all costs for this minority.
I mean, probably that doesn't mean there's not a way forward, right? If the Zelensky team can find a way to negotiations that they think will actually make Ukraine more secure, then they can get a coalition, and they can get a coalition behind it, and they can force it. Yes, they might lose power as a result. Yes, it's gonna be ugly and messy and so forth, but that is a possible way forward.
And one of the loudest things coming from that vocal minority is that Moscow simply can't be trusted at the bargaining table. Is this a valid assessment, or what should we be looking for from the Russian side that signals credibility? It signals some type of commitment or restraint to follow through on anything that's hammered out in this type of format, or does this criticism really echo cleanly, and that there's very little that Moscow can do right now to demonstrate that sense of constraint?
So clearly it's a valid concern. I mean, it would be crazy to think otherwise, right? After all that Russia has done in the last 2, but not only 2 years. One point to make, though, is that it is, of course, not unique to this war that the belligerents don't trust each other. It's kind of by definition a function of a war, that the warring parties who've been busy killing each other during the war are not in a position to trust one another. And it's also, widely discussed in the literature that this is one of the main reasons why states keep fighting, including even when they think they're going to lose, right? Because the peace is unappealing because you think the other side is just going to violate any agreement that is reached. And so, the difference between continuing to fight and is, I mean, therefore, there's a sort of logic to continuing a fight, even if you don't think it's necessarily going to work out for you. So, short version is that this is a problem, but it's not unique to this war. And you can try to mitigate it. You can't solve it, right? So that there are ways in which, ceasefires can be designed to make it harder to violate them. There are also a huge number of steps that Russia could be taking to demonstrate that are to signal that it is serious about these sorts of things, you know, including like ceasing a lot of the things that it's actually doing on the battlefield. But you know, over time, basically, this is only going to the perception is only going to change if Russia's behavior changes once this, you know, it's not going to happen before an agreement is reached. It would only be with the successful implementation of a ceasefire or some sort of agreement that ends the war. So I think it's sort of a reality rather than and that we're going to have to live with rather than a problem that has a solution.
I mean, I agree with that. You think, look, if you're at the happy place where a real deal is possible, you need to design that deal. And yeah, this is one of the things you can be thinking about in advance, right? You need to design that deal so there are repercussions for violating it. Right. So it's not just a matter of old-fashioned arms control about how many weapons you can have and where you can have them. It's about what happens. What does the other guy get to do if you violate? What you're trying to change the incentives. So how do you do that? How do you incentivize everyone to stick to the deal? And I think that's kind of the creative thinking that I would like to see more of.
And on that point, you know, I think, you brought up a good point about preparation, which is that, you know, it's important to think about your own interests and what you're prepared to, how therefore you think about trade-offs in the context of a negotiation. But the preparation that I was thinking of was precisely this technical piece, because again, you know, studies of interstate wars and how they end, like the quality of the ceasefire agreement matters in terms of the durability of peace. So if you have ceasefire agreements that don't have the sort of pieces that we know are associated with an enduring cessation of hostilities, you tend not to get an enduring cessation of hostilities, and be they sort of, you know, demilitarized zones or clarity of the provisions, another key feature of ceasefires that endure, and so on. And here I should like footnote Paige Fortna's work on this issue because it's sort of the definitive study. It matters, in other words. And so I think that there's some, you know, that's also preparatory work that can be done now. And the issue here, and I think this is not perhaps as widely appreciated as it should be, is compounded by the size of the front line, right? Like we are going to, you know, we don't have a nearly 2,000-kilometer front line if you take into account the undisputed Ukraine-Belarus border, the undisputed Russia-Ukraine border, and then the line of contact. And that is just, you know, a massive monitoring headache for any end of war scenario. And even if, and this seems, you know, unlikely at this stage or really any stage, the parties were to agree, or Russia were to agree to have like a third party peacekeeping operation, you'd need tens of thousands of them to cover that length of a line of contact, which is just, you know, so I think we're going to have to think outside the box in terms of solutions on monitoring there. Perhaps the unmanned kind would be more plausible in this context. But it is, you know, these are issues that should be examined now, so that when the table does appear, we're not starting from scratch.
Well, let's assume that the default is continuing hostilities.
That's a fair assumption.
As depressing as it is, in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways, how are Ukrainian society and the population dealing with the fact that this isn't spring 2022 anymore, and that appetite for continued massive financial and military aid is waning in many capitals? Let's start first with the Ukrainian approach before we kind of talk about the perspective from Washington, because I'm sure that gets aired time and time again in this city. We'll go from going there and talking to people. Are they realistic about the fact that there have to be adaptations made and that it's no longer business as usual in terms of the last 2 years? And what are they doing to accommodate the fact that this support is really taking a different direction?
Ukrainians kept asking me if the stalemate between the executive branch and Congress in the United States was intentional and designed to drive them to the negotiating table. And I kept saying, I'm so sorry, no. We actually are this much of the, no, this is American politics. Sorry about that. No, we're not doing this on purpose. We don't have a plan. So what you are, what I think is really interesting is in just kind of going to Ukraine at intervals, right? I'm not there full time. I show up every few months. And in December of 2022, when it was cold and the bombings were pretty intense and everybody, was drinking tea by generator, people really very consistently said, how long can this go on? How long can this go on? How long can this go on? August, September of 23, when the weather was nice and, the counteroffensive hadn't failed yet. And, you did see in the streets of Kiev, young people walking around with prosthetics. Like, it's not like there's no impact, but there was very much a we can do this forever sort of mood. This last trip, I would say, was somewhere in between. I mean, I think there is kind of a recognition that for now, at least, they're looking at a long war and they need to adapt to it. There's also just the reality that they're not, in fact, adapting to it. Just aside from not taking too long to build defenses, aside from the problems with personnel, the ammunition's not their fault. Okay, but the rest of it, that's a Ukrainian thing. There are also, you talk to people who will tell you how good they've gotten at dealing with evacuees, and you ask them, okay, so are you preparing for more evacuees? That the front line's going to keep going back and forth, and they look at you blankly. So, there's a disconnect between the narrative of, yes, we can do this forever, and the reality of what doing this forever means. You also get a lot of debates about, will people who have gone abroad come back or not? It's a commuter refugee crisis as it is. A whole lot of people go back and forth pretty consistently. But you hear very different stories about who's going to do what. And I will say, I think this is really important. We all function in bubbles. So I can go to Ukraine, and almost everybody I talk to believes that, there are these problems and the problems need to be fixed, and they'll argue about whose fault the problems are. But they're pretty committed to this. I know other people whose Ukrainian bubbles are very different, whose Ukrainian bubbles are all about how to keep their men from being mobilized, whose Ukrainian bubbles are, about how do you get out of the country. So, I think this is another challenge, is not to generalize from your personal experience, because it is going to be affected by who you talk to, and also what they're going to tell you. Like me as a foreigner, what are people going to tell me? My close friends are probably going to tell me what they actually think, but go out a line and people are going to tell me what they think they're supposed to. So I would say the Ukrainians have a narrative that this could very well be a long war. But it's not fully internalized, and it's certainly not fully acted upon.
And you found that true with the leadership as well, at least at the highest levels, that there's still this kind of resistance to adaptation. I mean, it's one thing to have the population still kind of feeling out this new reality, but the leadership itself hasn't made critical decisions to kind of, like you said, build defenses or prepare for a future that doesn't depend so heavily on Western aid, which may or may not be that forthcoming.
I've never talked to Vladimir Zelensky.
course, yeah.
So, well,
Very impressive.
I talk to people who talk to Vladimir Zelensky some of the time, though less and less as time goes on and his inner circle shifts. I think it depends. There is a lot of frustration with how this has gone. There are a lot of people who feel it's treasonous how this has gone, right? That that there and you get this from the public too, that there continues to be corruption in the MOD under these conditions. Like, how does this happen? How is this allowed? There's also awareness of what needs to happen. It's just that people are finding, it's hard to get public policy moving. I mean, we know this in our own system. I think there's shock when it's also hard. Like somebody told me at one point that, those first couple of months of war, it felt like everybody really was pulling together in the same direction and we cleaned it up and it was going to be great. And then like all the usual practices start coming back. And that's normal, but I think it is very frustrating for people who do see a better way forward.
Does that accord with your assessment of what's going on?
Well, I guess I would just take a step back and like maybe if we're sitting here a month from now, a supplemental of some kind will have passed. But the acute issue might recede slightly. I think your question, the way you framed it, points to a longer term problem, which is that, it would have to we'd have to have a supplemental every year and have this debate every year. There's not a set of circumstances when the Ukrainian government would be in a fiscal or materiel situation to be able to continue this in the same way as it has been for the last 2 years. And so it's either, the long war, carrying out the long war is not just a matter of Ukraine getting its policies right and having the political will and the sort of social buy-in for it. It will require, extraordinary amounts of assistance sustained over an extended period of time. And that, from my perspective, has always struck me as the weakest link in all of this, in that, it seems like that is a low probability outcome in terms of where Western policy can be, even if it's going to be sustained at some level that's much, much higher than it was before 2022. The kind of particularly military assistance that was, for example, delivered in the tail end of 2022, early 23 to facilitate the counteroffensive. I mean, that was conceived of as a one-off because it couldn't be repeated in the 2 to 3 year time horizon physically. So
I'll say that the Ukrainians I talked to generally were beginning to recognize that the United States might be wobbly, but they were pretty confident that the Europeans were going to pull it together because they buy the European line, the European narrative that this is their security. I've been listening to Europeans tell me this for a couple of years too, so I buy it, but they have a bit of the same problem of you talk the talk and then you figure out if the walk is walkable. And they really didn't expect to walk the walk without the Americans. And that's also, it's a different and difficult shift that they're trying to make now. But they do, in fairness to them, they are trying to make it. Let's see how it goes, right?
Is there a different type of support that's needed for the long haul than what's currently being discussed?
Well, I think that in parallel to this conversation that's happening between the two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and not only, there is a bilateral U.S.-Ukraine negotiation ongoing on the security commitments that were the framework of which was announced at the NATO Vilnius summit. There's G7 framework, and several of which bilateral agreements have been signed between Ukraine and Germany, and Ukraine and the UK, and Ukraine and France. And I think that the idea was that this would be, well, these are longer term documents in terms of the time horizon. And in the US case, the idea was to also use it as an opportunity to think about the sort of future force concept for Ukraine. And so that kind of thinking is at least, if it's resourced, is there. There's some talk about, Ukraine enabling Ukraine's own domestic defense industry to so that the country can be in a position to supply itself. I mean, before the war, we should note Ukraine was a top 10 global arms exporter. So it's not like it can't produce weapons. The challenge, of course, is that many of those facilities have been bombed since the war began. And the idea of building new ones in the middle of a war when they will become instant targets has struck me as a little bit odd. But nonetheless, it's a conversation about Ukraine's defense industry is an important one to have for the long term. I don't know where the discussion on long-term fiscal sustainability is. But that's clearly a conversation that needs to be had. I don't think the, over $3 billion a month, which is the last time I checked, if you take US and EU assistance together in terms of direct budgetary support, it goes via the IFIs, but nonetheless, it is something that could last forever. Sustainability, right? But there's another point to be made here, which is like, there's two kinds of worlds in which we can envision these sets of issues, right? There's the world in which Ukraine is actively fighting a war of this intensity. And there's a world in which it isn't, right? And obviously if we look at the fiscal piece, like the tax base would be pretty different if economic activity returns, right? If some of the up to 9 million of the people who've left return, right? Like, and on a permanent basis, if, their cities aren't subject to air raid sirens on a daily basis, or actual air attacks, right? So that would be pretty transformative in terms of those prospects. And, so it's sort of planning for two completely different realities. Now, you have to do contingency planning regardless, but, that's an important consideration to keep in mind. In other words, that the end of war piece facilitates all these other pieces of the equation as well.
Please.
Just one very quick thought on this, which is that we as Americans and our European allies have sustained far more expensive wars for longer in the past. This is fairly cheap. If you put out the numbers, it's incredibly expensive. If you put it in comparative perspective, it's a lot less expensive. It's certainly less expensive than doing the fight yourself. So, but it's a tough case to make. Politically, right? It's very hard to stand up in front of people and say that it's this is always a challenge of any kind of foreign spending, but it is true.
It's even more surprising to me because so much of that money goes to military production in the United States, which seem to have political benefits for the politicians that would advocate for it, but it's not being communicated as such. Olga, you talked about the European approach to this. We will finish up with one round about future security or economic architecture that Ukraine may or may not be moving closer to. The Europeans, you had these conversations about maybe more consistent or continued commitments to Europe. Do you see progress being made since the agreements to move forward on EU integration? Is this something that you're seeing prioritized, or is this just a public relations show to appeal to the population that there is this bright future at some point down the line?
So the EU is going to be talking about this shortly. It's really tough because prior to the full-scale invasion, the consensus was that they needed a break from expansion, that it's hard, it's expensive, it's problematical, the voting system is badly set up for this because, you have to have unanimity, and the more countries you have, the harder it is to get to unanimity. Go figure. You've got the problems of economic incorporation of more countries with the Polish farmers protesting. This is just a taste, right? The Ukrainians are very, very angry about the Polish farmers. And I kept telling them, you think this is bad? Wait until you're actually looking at real EU accession. Also, this is what happened to the Poles when they came in. They're just given back. So this is really hard. And that doesn't even get to the security commitments that are part of it. So I think, look, I think the EU's intention was always that this is meant to be symbolic, that this is, you know, we are saying that, yes, you are part of the West. If you're actually looking at how they're going to go in, well, look, the Moldovans are probably in better shape than the Ukrainians are in better shape than the Georgians. Weirdly, because one of them is in the middle of a war and it's smack in the middle, but that speaks more to Georgia than anything else. So look, I'll be shocked if they move at any kind of speed towards accession, but they will try to keep having trying to show that they're doing something. NATO is going to be under a lot of pressure at the summit here in DC this summer to show more than they were able to show at Vilnius. That's going to be another tough one. But I think where I thought you were going to go is kind of European security in the broader sense, right? That you've got Ukraine, and what's going on in Ukraine is seen as a threat to broader European security, because not just because it's a war in the center of Europe, but because you have a belligerent who is assumed to be likely to get dizzy with success and try to do more if it succeeds. So you have to prepare for that. And this, actually very much like assistance to Ukraine, is something where the talk gets very far ahead of the walk easily, particularly since the talk has become, not 1 inch, and the capacity to guarantee not 1 inch with anything other than deterrent threats is kind of limited. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch going forward.
Sobering. Sam, any thoughts on EU economic or security architecture integration?
So I wouldn't underestimate the power of the Brussels bureaucracy to sort of do with aspirant countries things that even those aspirant countries couldn't have imagined. And the process itself is going to be, have a significant impact on governance in Ukraine, regardless of whether it ends up in full-fledged membership or not, because we're now in the stage where they have, the chapters and they're going through them. And, even under the current circumstances, that means like, mini invasions of bureaucrats every few months who are, telling them how to rewrite their fisheries code or whatever. So I think, that could have an important impact on Ukraine over time. It's hard to imagine how in wartime that plays out, but nonetheless, I think, I totally agree on the actually getting over the finish line being hard to imagine at this stage, given the fact that, I don't know, I mean, you see these numbers like 40% of the EU budget would or the agricultural budget would immediately go to Ukraine if they were to become members, tomorrow or something like that, given the nature of how subsidies are handed out. So, but yeah, I think actually there's more of a process there than there is on the NATO side. And I think that the bilateral security commitments are meant as the deliverable that Ukraine will have in the security domain in lieu of a short-term pathway to membership or something approximating it.
Well, that seems like the final word, but it's not, because we'd like to hear from all of you. So let's take a moment to take some questions from the audience. We do have a mic coming around. If you could please introduce yourself to everyone so we know where you're coming from, your name and your affiliation would be great. And we'll start here in the front.
My name is Victoria Feinberg. I was born in the Soviet Union. Now it's Ukraine, the city of Kharkiv. Okay, I have a very catastrophic, I don't know how to say, question. I hope the answer is no. However, I want to ask it. If the Russians policy or aim to have a boundary between Russia and the NATO countries. What can stop Russia of dropping nuclear weapons, let's say, on Kiev? This is not a NATO country, so it would not trigger NATO response. Why can't Russia just bomb Ukraine out of existence to create a buffer between itself and NATO?
We haven't gone nuclear yet, so we might as well at
Well-
some point. Who would like to start?
Good.
So I think the United States, as I understand it from reading the newspaper, has communicated that the Russians would face a pretty severe response, probably not a nuclear response, but a really, really nasty conventional response if they were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And before you say that that's inadequate, I would say the Russians have for a long time been far more nervous about Western conventional capabilities than about their nuclear capabilities. And a demonstration of that can do a lot of damage with conventional weapons in response would, I think, strengthen that. And I think the Russians really are nervous about it. They're also nervous about the fact that this would bring Western states into the war, and that would lead to further escalation. If the Russians threaten with a thing they're scared of, that doesn't mean that there's absolutely no way they'll do it, but it does mean that they're scared of it themselves. I also would point out that they are up against NATO. They don't have buffers. Buffers make sense in one way of thinking about military power. But if you have long-range missiles, if you have long-range aircraft, they make less sense. This doesn't solve, Ukraine in the middle doesn't solve Russia's security problem the way it might have in a previous time. So.
Did that.
Professor Hill.
Bill Hill, I'm a retired state foreign service officer, now associated with the Kennan Institute. You've kept the discussion pretty much in Europe and or Western Eurasia. But there is a global aspect to this that I wonder how you think it enters in. I mean, we've said in the U.S. and elsewhere we're slapping sanctions on the Russians that have never seen the likes of before, and we do this about every couple of weeks. And the so-called global South, or the other 60% or the other 80%, depending upon who's saying it, but those who are not in NATO, Japan, AU, Australia, New Zealand. Basically, the Russians are coping with the sanctions. Meanwhile, Russian rhetoric has gotten more global and actions and resources. Increasingly, you see serious Russians talking about a change in the global security and political order, not simply things that they need in Europe, turning to organizations like SCO, BRICS, other things like this. And a wonderful new access, if we bring back the axis of evil, except this time it's Iran, North Korea, China all supplying Russia. I mean, out of this, how much of this is Russian simply coping out of necessity? How much is a broader demand? And how much of a problem does this create in reaching a solution that will be sustainable within Ukraine? Is it something that you think the Russians can abandon if they get what they want in Ukraine? And if so, what is it that Russia really has to have in Ukraine?
Lots of questions there, Bill. I think the way I thought I understood where your question was going is the shift away from Western centrism in Russian foreign policy a show, or is it going to outlast even the war? I think that it is that there are things that have happened, and enough time has passed that this really is a shift, and that will endure. We've seen, you know, trade patterns have fundamentally altered. Even just people flows, right? You know, I mean, the fact that for 2 years, there have been no direct flights between, well, any Western country and Russia, but, you know, particularly Europe. And now many even land borders are completely closed. Most of the land borders with the EU are completely closed. So that is a pretty profound shift. And I think, you know, even look at like the the car market in Russia, which is now like 70% Chinese. So it's hard to see how that kind of thing would be undone, given that, you know, where the trend lines are heading. Now, that will create problems, you know, for Russia over time, and it's not going to be there's going to be zero interaction between Russia and what it calls unfriendly countries. But it does seem like it'll be of a dramatically different character. And there'll be much less of it.
I mean, I agree with that. I would add a couple of points. Think the sanctions lesson is one that ought to have been learned ages ago, which is the countries imposing sanctions design them to be something they can live with. They then demand that other countries also implement them. Those countries weren't in on the decisions of how you design the sanctions, right? So like it would hurt their economies. Why would they do this? What exactly are you going to give them to make up for it? And this was part of what the grain deal was about, right? Was kind of this, oh, we got to do something. We got like, we've just screwed a whole lot of people. And we want them to go along with us. How do we do it? This keeps biting, right? Because nobody wants to define it's hard enough to define sanctions you can live with, much less sanctions everybody else can live with. But then it is kind of ridiculous to get really angry at states for failing to implement your sanctions. I think it is, and I think it is also a lesson that because of that, your sanctions are not going to do the things you want them to do, even if they were likely to in the first place, which I have big questions about. But, you know, even if you assume that they would have been effective, like you have to think about this, and you can't get what you want without considering the interests of a global community, not just the regional North Atlantic and its friends. Again, I'm not sure this lesson gets through, but I think it's a pretty important lesson. And what you get is kind of a lot of like, oh, why won't they go along with this? And you'll hear from these countries, you talk to them, the sovereignty points, they're with Ukraine, right? But the implications on what to do about it, they have a different view. And moreover, they're a little annoyed that they're supposed to all fall into line when it's Ukraine's sovereignty, but when it's theirs, nobody falls into line with them. And I think what's happening between Israel and Hamas, and just the human suffering there is also, right? It actually undercuts a certain amount of Ukraine's position. Just you can't point to Ukrainian suffering right now if you're going to at all compare it to Gaza, right? I mean, people have been asking me, does Gaza distract, blah, blah, blah. Distraction doesn't worry me, but kind of the sheer amount of human suffering everybody's willing to live with in Gaza makes it really hard to make the case that Ukraine is suffering so terribly. But in terms of Russian foreign policy, look, I think Sam has written about this. This has been a shift that's been going on for a long time. This isn't new. It's been hard to do. This has accelerated it.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a junior here at George Washington University. I guess my question was still about the buffer. In his ascension speech about a day ago, Putin said that he would be looking for a sanitary zone between Ukraine and Russia. So I guess you were saying that the buffer zone wouldn't serve its needs. So why do you think was Putin's motive for making a claim like that?
So You were looking at me, but Olga said that, but, well, I guess it was directed at you, so if you'd like to take it.
You can add, I'm sure you'll have things to add that I'll miss. Look, if you're trying to, if you want to have a ceasefire and you have a ceasefire line, you are going to want to move forces back behind it. It's harder to restart the war, easier to see that you're about to restart the war, all of these things. That's different from a buffer. It's similar, but like there are similarities, but it's not quite the same thing. The idea of a buffer country is that you've got countries in between that everybody has to go through. Now, in both cases, your long-range missiles can overfly. So it's a question of what kind of war you're expecting. And the war between the West and Russia isn't that the tanks all go across Ukraine, it's that the missiles fly.
Right. So Putin's comment was specifically in regards to a question, or in response to a question about the cross-border raids that were sort of an attempt perhaps to spoil his so-called re-election victory, that some of these groups fighting with the Ukrainians who crossed into the Belgorod region and, you know, carried out raids, etc. I think the idea there is, you know, there's a difference between a buffer state and a security zone on, you know, either side of a ceasefire line. And I think that, or even a border, frankly. And, you know, you can have thinned out zones if we're to give the charitable interpretation of that comment. But I think the more frightening, you know, version of it is that that even beyond the areas that they claim to have annexed, they're going to want to have some degree of, you know, control, which at this point is aspirational, given that they haven't even been able to take control of the 4 or 5 regions that they claim to have annexed. But could be is not exactly a reassuring signal of limited intentions.
Just very quickly, the Ukrainians would love to have very strict limits on what the Russians can put on their side of the border. Like they would love to see Belgorod as a demilitarized area. They'd be very supportive of that idea.
Hello, my name is Sofia Pavlenko. I'm a GW student originally from Yalta, Ukraine. I'd just like to ask, it's been roughly a month and a week since the appointment of Syrskyi to the commander-in-chief post of the ZSU. Now looking at it from as we enter the end of March, how has military strategy changed in terms of, and has it changed in any way substantially in terms of warfighting? Has the move been politically successful? And in terms of the situation on the ground, I believe the Kyiv Independent reported around 2 weeks after his appointment that in some interviews with soldiers on the front line in Avdiivka, that they were disappointed by the move. So simply, do we expect military strategy to change in any way successfully? And is this a politically expedient move?
Go ahead.
You will hear speculation that the move was politically motivated, right? That Zelensky saw Zaluzhny as a political threat and wanted to remove him. Now, that might be true. Certainly, there was a lot of tension between the two men. If it was true, it's kind of a weird move, right? You take the guy who you think is a political threat and you remove him from a position where he can't run for office because he's a military officer, and you make him an ambassador, but certainly a place where it's much easier to develop a political career. And also because Ukraine was in a position that it was going to have to start falling back to more defensible positions, you've set up his successor for huge unpopularity because he's going to be the one overseeing that. So again, it's kind of not saying that's not what happened. That's not the motivation. I'm just saying there's some weird disconnects there. This is like what I was really struck by in Ukraine was that everybody had an opinion on this. Like there were Zaluzhny fans, there were Syrskyi fans, but everybody had an opinion on this, which is a really, no, do people normally have very strong opinions about who commands their military forces to this extent? Maybe, I don't know. I think Zaluzhny was very popular with the troops. Syrskyi less so. Arguably that makes him less of a political threat, etc. In terms of strategy, I think the two men do have different approaches, but Ukraine is still stuck in the same strategics. In terms of tactics, they're going to have different approaches. In terms of strategy, I don't think they've got that much of a choice right now. They've got to give themselves the space to rebuild their armed forces and get people armed. And that's the case, whoever's in charge.
I would just add one little footnote on that, you know, Zaluzhny still hasn't publicly said anything since the announcement of his appointment as ambassador. So we don't even know if he's accepted it.
I think he'll go.
Julian Waller, Russia Studies Program at CNA, Center for Naval Analyses. So the trajectory of your conversation is the war goes on for a year, maybe 2 more years, at worst 3 more years, and we eventually get to a point of negotiations of some sort. Ceteris paribus, all things being equal, right? In your view, who at the end of the day, on say the Western side or the pro-Ukrainian side, is going to be initiating substantive negotiations? Is it Ukraine itself? Is it the United States? Is it France or Germany? Who caves first, or who sort of sees the writing on the wall? Again, let's bracket off Russia having a regime change or something like that. Thank you.
So I think regardless of who's interested in it, I mean, putting aside the wild card of regime change in the US, so to speak, well, it certainly adds a degree of unpredictability to my answer. So I'm going to have to assume some continuity of policy that perhaps will be subject to revision in a little bit less than a year. You know, I think Ukraine is going to have to be in the lead, both for, I mean, first and foremost for practical reasons, right? I mean, the issues that will be on the table are ones that you know, only Ukraine has the can really weigh in on, right? But of course, for moral reasons as well, like they're going to have to be in the lead. The question is, you know, so in terms of initiation, I think the initiative will have to come from the Ukrainians. There are those who argue that you need some sort of broader parallel negotiation involving, or set of consultations involving the United States and its European allies and Russia, in order to have any, like that this, you know, a Russia-Ukraine deal in itself will not lead to a sustainable end to the war. You know, I think that that's not a crazy argument, but I think there's going to be a lot of reticence to do that, and there won't be a perceived need, I think, in most Western capitals to do it in the immediate context of an end of war scenario. So, you know, I would hope that Ukraine would get support from its partners, as it does on the battlefield, in you know, if and you know, when it's ready. But the initiative would have to come from Ukraine. I would just quibble with the caving terminology, but that's neither here nor there.
I would add to that only that the Russians are banking on Western support for Ukraine being what disappears, which is what forces the Ukrainians to negotiate. So it's not that the Americans or the French go to Putin and say, we'd like to negotiate. It's the Americans or the French or the Germans, with varying degrees of likelihood in those three cases, cut off the support, and the Ukrainians no longer have a choice. Hence the question I got, are you doing this thing in Washington on purpose? But I am definitely one of those people who will say that a deal that's Ukraine only is not sustainable. That doesn't mean it's impossible. That's where it goes. It just means that it's going to break.
I would agree with that. But on one more thing on that score. So there's something that's Putin has said in the last couple of weeks, and of course we can completely discount everything he says because a lot of it is, blatantly untrue. But in this case, it's more of an interesting potential window into his own thinking because it was unprompted and there's no seeming other logic to it that I can discern. He said twice that, we're ready for negotiations, but not because the enemy is running out of weapons. He'd quibble with your comment, but because, and then he followed on, I think it was at the press conference on Sunday, by saying, we want to make sure that the I think he used the term enemy or adversary doesn't use this as just an opportunity to rest and refit and rearm. Sound familiar? But instead to have, that we get some guarantee of our own security. But I was struck by that, and it was said twice, which suggests that it's at least something that as a talking point that he's coming out with. And I don't understand, it's kind of like an utterance against his own interest. It seems like the point here being that like the immediate, they want, if the deal that he, at least allegedly says that he's interested in is not about the current position, but the longer term issues that they will face with a deeply hostile and regardless of what happens between now and whenever the war ends, well-armed Ukraine with a robust security relationship with the West. I mean, that's going to be a security challenge for Russia, for the indefinite future.
Don't you think that's exactly what they're going to try to negotiate to avoid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't, I mean, that's also kind of like, I'd like to avoid the rain. But some of this is going to be things that they're not going to have much ability to put a stop to. Or they might try. That doesn't, it wouldn't be the first time.
And I think we have time for one more.
Thank you so much. I'm Marcia McGraw-Olive from Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Caspian Policy Center. I've loved your conversation and I always love listening to both of you. Two things that the leaders of each country would want to avoid that you haven't mentioned. On Putin's side, it's mobilization. And on Zelensky's side, I think it really is an election. I would like you to go back to David's excellent question earlier about the risks that these leaders face from these realities. Because if Zelensky avoids even giving a date for an election, that means that he's living under martial law. And if he does this endlessly, he will have to be declared by Freedom House and others as basically a dictator. And how do you give a lot of Western support to somebody who's not accepting the legitimacy of this political system? So there's an honest reason why you don't want an election today, but to say we won't have one in a year puts him in the position, makes him very vulnerable for his legitimacy. And for Putin, given the amount of major losses of his most elite troops, he has a manpower issue as well. I mean, they're scraping up people from the most weird places, you know, to fight. The speculation is that with this big, I love the 87.22% of the return on the vote, that's that specific, that he's going to come up with some unpopular move, which mobilization would be the case. So how do these two leaders go forward and get past these, what could be obvious real risks? And I say that with the hope that that it leads in some way to more negotiation.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that the Russian partial mobilization in the fall of 2022 was the most, well, you know, I don't know about the most, but perhaps the most significant challenge to his system that since the war began. It really looked pretty touch and go there for a while. And they were able to pull it off, but I think the lesson was learned, and instead they started throwing money at the problem, right? And having this de facto soft mobilization by contract. In other words, basically providing huge financial incentives for people to, you know, somewhat voluntarily sign contracts with the military. As a result, I don't think that they're in a mobilization crunch unless they want to do something incredibly ambitious on the offensive, in which case they will certainly need, you know, to do another mobilization. So I think that this is actually going to be a pretty important indicator of how far Russia wants to go, whether they actually do that. Because there isn't an acute need in the same way that there is in Ukraine right now, as far as I understand. If they keep losing, you know, tens of thousands of forces by taking relatively small towns or cities, we could revise that assessment in a few months. But I actually, on the question of Ukraine's election, so I think that the bottom line of mobilization is it seems like they're likely to go to significant lengths to avoid having to do that again, and they already have. But that might well not change even with the 87.22%. I have more sympathy for the where Zelensky is on the elections issue. I don't understand. So, you know, martial law has been declared. You cannot have elections when martial law has been declared. There is a sort of constitutional weird, you know, lacuna of how you extend a president's term under martial law if he hasn't been reelected in the 5-year period of his term. But, you know, I mean, he also technically has a constitutional majority in the parliament. He probably could find some solution to that. And I believe that the issue has been referred to the Constitutional Court quite recently. But, you know, if the war is still ongoing and at the intensity that it is today in a year, how could, you know, regardless of Freedom House's ratings, it doesn't really seem to me to be a practical thing for there to be nationwide elections to be held in Ukraine, given that, you know, like large gatherings of people are often targets. So, you know, it is a dilemma. There are obviously legitimacy challenges the longer that this goes on, but I don't see a way that out of it for the Ukrainian government so long as the war is ongoing at this level of intensity, unless, you know, it dramatically reduces in intensity. Do you have a different view?
On Russia, I'll just add that Russia's supply of poor young men seems to be substantial. And that's unfortunate for everybody, perhaps most especially those poor young men. In Ukraine, you know, what's really interesting is when talk of elections surfaced late last summer, early fall, What the scuttlebutt was in Kiev was Zelensky wants to hold elections, so he'll have a mandate so he can negotiate. So, you know, it's depends on who you ask. There are two kinds of elections, right, that could be held, presidential and parliamentary. You could do one and not the other. The problems are who votes? What do you do about displaced people, whether they're abroad or just not in the place where they would be voting? These problems are more acute for parliamentary elections because, you know, you're voting for your MP. How do military personnel vote? What do you do about territory that's under occupation? There are solutions to all of these problems. They are always imperfect solutions, which make for an imperfect election. And one of the arguments against having elections under these conditions is that it makes Ukraine actually look less democratic because they can't hold a proper election. I actually think that as long as the war is going on, as long as there's real cause, all of the watchdog groups will not brand Zelensky a dictator for that reason. If he does, you know, if he cranks down on the press further, if, you know, things happen in Ukraine that are very different, they might have other logics, but that's not where we are now. And I don't think that when Zelensky's thinking about elections, he's worried about his Freedom House ranking.
Well, thank you both very much for a very stimulating conversation and for helping us kick off this event series. Thank you very much to Sarah Hazar for arranging all of this today. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I invite you to not only thank our panelists, but also join us in the back for some refreshments after the talk. So